On November 24th, the Bronx Grand Concourse will celebrate its centennial. With its Art Deco structure and its political and social history, the Concourse is one of New York City's architectural delights. And now, a longtime New York Times editor wrote a book on the history of the Grand Concourse titled Boulevard of Dreams. Connie Rosenblum, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
You're not originally from the Bronx. You weren't born here.
No. Everyone asks me that. They say, is that why you did the book? And I said no. I grew up in upstate New York. I came to New York after college, but I always wished I'd grown up in the Bronx. And in a way, doing this book was the next best thing for me. Okay,
so what was it that motivated you? When did you get this idea that the Grand Concourse deserved a book?
Well, in New York, one of the things I did was work for the New York Daily News, and I did some reporting on the Bronx and on the Grand Concourse. And this was in the early 80s, at a time when the Bronx was really struggling. But I knew that the boulevard had a grand and wonderful history, and I wanted I thought about a book even at that point. I wanted to do a book that would talk about that history and would explain what had happened to the area. And by the time I actually got to do the book, which was after, in the 21st century, things were looking up in the Bronx, and it turned out to be an even better time to write such a book.
But the history of the Grand Concourse is really, in many ways, the history of the whole Bronx, right?
And in many ways, the history of New York City and the history of the American city, which was one of the things that interested me, because it was, as you said, it opened in 1909, and starting in the 20s and really continuing through the 50s, it was a remarkable mecca for immigrants and immigrants' children, primarily Jewish, but there were also Irish and Italian and other nationalities. And they came, many of them, from the Lower East Side. They made their way to Brooklyn, to the South Bronx, and they were very privileged to live even near the Grand Concourse. They would say, well, I live 5 blocks away or 3 blocks away. And of course, if you could live on the Grand Concourse, and especially in one of the beautiful Art Deco buildings, it really showed that you had arrived, that you had made it.
So that would be today like saying you live on Park Avenue in Manhattan?
Well, maybe West End Avenue.
Okay.
Not quite as good as Park Avenue.
So it was where the well-to-do...
Absolutely. Not the super rich, but the very comfortable middle class, upper middle class, the doctors, the lawyers, the businessmen, the teachers, and living on the concourse or even nearby was very, very significant in those years. One of the reasons was the buildings were beautiful, the beautiful Art Deco buildings. Everyone remembers the Fish Building with the mosaics in the front. People went to Loewy's Paradise, this beautiful Italian Baroque movie palace near Fordham Road. They shopped on Fordham Road. Of course, they went to Yankee Stadium. Everyone was a Yankees fan back then.
Well, you said that the concourse itself was inaugurated in 1909, 100 years ago.
Yes.
What was there before?
Very, very little, and that's what makes it so remarkable that the person who thought of the highway, envisioned it, a French engineer named Louis Ries, when he came up with the idea for the boulevard, there was nothing. It was a wilderness. It was a long ridge north-south in the Bronx, and it was just woodland and trees and ravines. But he pictured this 4.5-mile long, 11-lane wide highway that would stretch up to Marshallou Parkway. And originally he thought it would be a route along which people rode horses and drove horses and carriages and were promenaders. But by the time it opened in 1909, the automobile had arrived, and so they had to retrofit the highway so it could accommodate the car.
Wow. Now, when it opened, was it the whole stretch or was it parts of it?
It started at 161st Street. That was the original gateway to the concourse, where the courthouse is and the Concourse Plaza Hotel and Joyce Kilmer Park. And some years later was extended south along what had been Mott Avenue down to 139th Street. So it was really a great sweep of highway.
And the very wonderful Art Deco buildings that came, did they come later?
They came starting in the 30s. They didn't come right away because World War I intervened in the teens. But starting in the 20s, the very impressive apartment houses like Roosevelt Gardens, originally known as the Theodore Roosevelt Roosevelt and considered the largest apartment complex in the world when it opened in 1922. And the Lewis Morris, everybody remembers the Lewis Morris. Those were the buildings that arrived in the 20s. And then in the 30s, even during the Depression, they started building the Art Deco buildings that are the ones that are the most famous buildings along the Grand Concourse.
The type of people that live there, obviously, the kind of, I mean, especially the income level of the people that have lived there, has shifted over the years, I imagine.
Considerably.
How so?
Yeah. Well, during the really from the 1920s into the 50s, it was a very comfortable middle class, or aspiring to middle class.
All the way to the 50s.
Middle, yeah, you know, till the years after the war, but. After the war, things started changing. The children didn't want to live in the parents' neighborhood. The apartments were getting older and shabbier. They seemed small. The suburbs were beckoning. A lot of public and private money was going to the suburbs, making them very attractive. And increasingly, what had been a very stable and, I have to say, also white and middle-class neighborhood began to change. Blacks and Latinos from the South Bronx started moving into the apartments that became vacant. And in the beginning, the change was very orderly, but it started quickening, and increasingly more and more very low-income families started moving in, many on welfare. Drugs became a problem, crime became a problem, but a major problem is both the public and private institutions stopped considering this part of the Bronx an area in which to invest and support. And the area fell apart. That's when it became labeled the South Bronx.
But sort of, there was a letdown from the city in terms of like
the city.
support.
There was great indifference. The concept of planned shrinkage, which was proposed, the idea being, well, if we don't like the people who are living in these areas, why don't we just, you know, not shovel the snow from their streets or collect the garbage or fix the schools or the hospitals? And at the same time, banks and insurance companies didn't want to invest in this area, and federal money was going into the suburbs for highways and low-cost loans, and the inner cities, not just New York, the Bronx, Harlem, Brooklyn, but Detroit and Newark and on, really were the ones that suffered.
Could it be also that the new tenants, the new people coming in, didn't have the same political influence than the previous folks?
Well, that's a very good point. And also, the Bronx during those years suffered from many political problems. You know, borough presidents went to jail,
corruption,
and they did not have the clout that some other parts of the city had. There was really there were very few stakeholders for the Bronx in those years.
So the founder, who's the founder of the Bronx? You mentioned the Grand Concourse.
The person who designed it, his name was Louis Reese. He came from France to the United States when he was 17.
He's an immigrant himself.
He was an immigrant himself. The man who designed Loewy's Paradise was an immigrant. In many respects, this part of the city was built by immigrants.
Was it built with private funds, or was it built?
Private money. All these apartment houses were private.
And the road?
Private apartments, city money. Yeah, with a lot of.
So how does this foreigner or immigrant convince the city to fund such a project?
Well, when he, after coming to the United States when he was 17, he got a job with the municipal entity then running the Bronx, which at that point was not part of New York City. It was not annexed until 1874, and he worked his way up, and at one certain point, by 1890, he became the person who was in a position to propose roads through this area of the Bronx, which badly needed roads. And he proposed this beautiful, grand, gorgeous highway lined with trees and with underpasses to keep commercial traffic under the main highway, which is why it's always been such a great parade route for the borough, because the Grand Concourse and parades, during wars and when wars were won, and presidential candidates used to drive up and down the boulevard. Everybody remembers when Franklin Delano Roosevelt came, and Harry Truman, and especially John F. Kennedy. It was thrilling to see these people come to the Bronx.
The name itself, what is it? Who came up with it? The Grand Concourse.
This was Louis Reese. A Grand Boulevard and Concourse was what he proposed originally. He called it the Speedway Concourse because the horses were going to be trotting up and down. But eventually, it just became known as the Grand Concourse, and now people just call it the Concourse.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back with Connie Rosenblum, and we'll keep talking about the history of the Grand Concourse. Fascinating stuff to me anyway. We'll be right back.